Good evening. Can everyone hear me? Outstanding. All right. How's everyone doing? Yeah. It is wonderful to see you on this battle anniversary, 160th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. And I was just talking to Wayne, and I was just telling him just how pleased I am with just everything that's happening in the community, in the park. There's this energy out there that I hadn't felt in previous years, and it just feels great. And I hope you all feel the same about this battle anniversary. And yeah, we can clap if you want to. And we have a special treat tonight. So welcome to the 2023 Annual Sacred Trust Talks and Book Signings presented by the Gettysburg Foundation and the Gettysburg National Military Park. We are pleased to collaborate with the Gettysburg Foundation to invite renowned Civil War historians, authors, National Park Service rangers, licensed battlefield guides, and experts to participate in Sacred Trust and share their unique perspectives with our visitors. This evening's conversation is with best-selling author Jeff Shaara. He will discuss the inspiration for some of his works related to American history in a conversation with Gettysburg Foundation President and CEO Wayne Motts. Jeff will share some of his thoughts behind his processes for selecting themes, working on and researching subjects, writing and creating his books. You will have an opportunity and are encouraged to ask questions as part of this conversation. Jeff Shaara is a New York Times best-selling author of 19 novels that cover American history from the Revolutionary War through Korea. His Civil War novel, Gods and Generals, was the basis for the major motion picture of the same name. Jeff's latest novel, The Old Lion, released this May, covers the life of Teddy Roosevelt. Jeff and his wife, Stephanie, live in Gettysburg. Please join me in welcoming Jeff Shaara.
All right. Thank you so much, Steve. We really appreciate it. On behalf of the Gettysburg Foundation, we want to thank Jeff and Stephanie for spending the evening here with us. They've spent all day here, so why not spend the whole evening here, right? His hand about ready to fall off with the line he had over here signing books. And boy, what a great treat. So I'm just really excited because I thought this would be really great to have just a conversation, Jeff, on some things, and we really appreciate your time. And so I want to start off. We're going to do a couple questions, which I have, and then we're going to come out to the audience and we'll do some questions related from the audience. I will get up, I will take the microphone, I will get to you. You can ask your question of Jeff, and then he can answer after we have our discussion up here. So hopefully everybody will get a lot of input from everybody, not just myself here. So Jeff, one of the things that really has intrigued me, now you heard the superintendent just say you've got like these 19 works. It's all the way from the Revolution all the way up. You've got every military history time period that you can think about. Biography, you just did Teddy Roosevelt. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. But inquiry minds want to know. So do you lock yourself in a room and don't get out until you write certain paragraphs or an amount of work? Or how does Jeff write? What's the process of that? The research, the writing, and I guess how do you go about doing it?
Well, I don't need to lock the door, but I do have sanctuary. I mean, in my house, we took our attic. We restored an old home here, and I took the attic and finished it, and it's my office. And so I can go upstairs, and I'm pretty much sealed off from the rest of the house. And one thing, my father, and I hope most of you know, my father was a writer all his life. He wrote The Killer Angels. He had some interesting habits that I don't have, but he would listen to classical music when he wrote. And I would wake up in the middle of the night and hear Beethoven, and I would know that meant he was working, which was a good thing. I have absolute silence. It would drive me crazy. If I play music, I've tried this. If I play music, I start listening to the music, and I just lose my concentration completely. So it's got to be, dead quiet. And so having the sanctuary in my attic is a perfect setup for me. So it's and there's no set time to it. I mean, I'm a sort of a 10 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon kind of guy, which is sort of sane. My father, getting back to the comparison, my father was a midnight to 5 a.m. guy. There was a tough life. He would write all night and then sleep till noon and then get up and go teach at Florida State in the afternoon. It was a tough way to make a living. So I'm very fortunate that because I do this full time, I don't have to have a real job, which is an enormous advantage. There are not many writers, I will brag on myself, there are not many writers you will meet who don't have a real job. Because very few people can make as they will tell you, it's tough to make a living writing. And I've been extremely fortunate, and I don't take that for granted, that I am able to do this full time, which is a huge advantage. It's why I can turn out a book a year. In some cases, in several runs, I'll produce a book a year, which is tough, but it's doable, but it's full time. It's 7 days a week. And as Stephanie will say, there are some days when Sunday morning comes, it makes no difference to me if it's Sunday, Monday, Saturday, whatever, I go to work. And I'll produce what I can produce that day. So it's a good system for me. It doesn't work for everybody, but it certainly has worked for me, and I'm very, very happy about that and very proud of it.
And now you discussed the writing process. Obviously, by the time, excuse me, you get to the writing process, you've already done all the research, and I know you've done something on Pearl Harbor. You've had all these things, so I take it you go to these. What's the process of doing some of that?
The research is the biggest part of it. I spend more time on the research, and the research all comes first. I can't research and write and research and write. That would drive me crazy. So I do all the research first. It's an enormous amount of reading. I will read 30 or 40 books for every book that I write. And it's wherever possible original source material, diaries, memoirs, collections of letters, the accounts of the people who were there, because those are the voices I have to hear. Going to the ground, and that's a lesson, again, getting back to my father, that's a lesson I learned from my father by coming to Gettysburg, is go to the ground, walk in the footsteps of these characters. And now I can't, there are times when I can't do that. It's just not possible. I did a book on Korea, on the Chosin Reservoir, called The Frozen Hours, about the Marines at Chosin. And I wanted to go to Chosin. I feel stupid saying that because I didn't know that the Chosin Reservoir is in North Korea. And I actually, someone at the State Department said to me, "We can get you in."
Yeah. Oh boy.
That was the end of the sentence.
Yeah.
And so my wife said, "No, we're not doing that. That's probably not a good idea." And there are some other examples. I did a book, a first of a trilogy on the World War II in Europe called The Rising Tide. It was about North Africa and Sicily. And I wanted to go to North Africa because Rommel, the Desert Fox, the German commander in North Africa, had the great fights with the British, with Montgomery, and then finally with Patton. All the stuff that was destroyed is still there. It's the desert. Nothing happens to it. So out in the middle of the Libyan desert is all this wrecked equipment. How cool would that be? And I wanted to go. And again, the State Department said, "We really don't think it's a good idea for an American to be wandering around the Libyan desert." So much for that idea. But those are exceptions. For the most part, there is one more. I did a 2-book set in the war in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor and Midway. Now, Pearl Harbor, I spent a lot of time there. What a fabulous place that is. I wanted to go to Midway. It's about 1,500 miles from Pearl Harbor, sort of out in the middle of absolute nowhere in the Pacific Ocean. The Navy wouldn't let me. Apparently there are things on Midway they don't want you to see. So I was not able to go to Midway. But yeah, definitely in every case, whenever possible. Now, my latest book on Teddy Roosevelt, The Old Lion, I wanted to go to his birthplace in New York City, his home at Sagamore Hill and up on Long Island in New York. I couldn't go. I was working on the book, COVID. Everything was closed. Everything was shut down. Now, I've made up for lost time. I mean, we were just actually at Sagamore Hill about 3 weeks ago. But that hurt because I really wanted to. I mean, these places are there. They exist. And it's invaluable to me to get the experience of just seeing it and, well, if I may say, feeling it. just, the vibrations. I mean, I'm not psychic or anything, but it matters to walk in these footsteps, and it really adds to the research.
And so, Jeff, you mentioned the old line, which obviously the superintendent mentioned is your new release for May, and you just mentioned about the visits you made there. Tell us about that. What was the spark for that? Why did you want to choose Teddy Roosevelt? Tell us about the development
Well,
of that.
first of all, let me tell you what the Old Lion is and what it is not. It is not a biography. There are lots of those. I'm not a biographer. I'm not qualified to do that. But what I did with the Old Lion is this is the story of Teddy Roosevelt's life as told by him late in his life. Virtually on his deathbed, he's being interviewed, and this is all true. It's a real person. Herman Hagedorn was an author who interviewed Roosevelt and wrote 2 books about him, contemporary books with Roosevelt's life. And so I use Hagedorn as the method to get Roosevelt to talk about his early life, and then you go there. So you go to his childhood, and you see some of the things that happened to him then. You go to the Dakota Territory when he became a cattle rancher, and he had absolutely no idea what he was doing. That incredible experience in what is today North Dakota. The Spanish-American War, the Rough Riders, what it's like. There are several chapters of what it's like for him in Cuba, leading the Rough Riders, and his, as Assistant Secretary of the Navy, and which a great experience there. Governor of New York, then his vice presidency, and I love this story. I'll just tell briefly the story of how he becomes vice president. He is governor of New York. In Albany, they hate him, because all the powers, all the party people, the party machinery that's been entrenched there for years, he comes in and he's a reformer. He wants to reform everything, clean it up, clean up the graft and corruption. Well, that doesn't make him a lot of friends, because the people doing the graft and corruption are sort of in charge in Albany, in the New York State Assembly, the legislature. And he fights them tooth and nail, and again, they hate him. Opportunity comes up. William McKinley is running for re-election as president in 1900. His vice president, a guy named Hobart, dies. Well, McKinley needs a vice president. So there's this scramble to try to find somebody to fill that position. And of course, these powers in Albany are pushing hard to get Roosevelt to take the job. And Roosevelt hates the idea, because he knows if he becomes vice president, nobody will ever hear from him again. He says, I could leave Washington for 2 weeks at a time. Nobody would know I'm gone. So McKinley approaches him. He reluctantly becomes vice president, and it's exactly what he predicted. He just becomes nobody in Washington. And then McKinley is assassinated. And just like that, Roosevelt's president of the United States in 1901. And that transition, and then what he does once he becomes president, is a big part of this book. And then after the fact, when he's no longer president, his trip to the Amazon, which is late in his life, which nearly kills him, and which he has no business going. He's not healthy when he does this. Goes with his son and a number of Brazilian scientists and so forth, and they're going down this river of the unknown. Nobody knows where this river goes, and they're going to map it. And Roosevelt's all excited about this, and it nearly kills him. And that's the sort of the way the book kind of ends up. And then you go back to the present day, which is late 1918, 1919, when Roosevelt's at the end of his own life. Now, I've just told you a bunch more of the book than I should have. I only say that because in the past I've been guilty of sort of telling stories about everything that's in whatever book it is, everything that's in the book, and my wife has scolded me more than once that you realize, of course, now there's no reason for them to buy the book. So I'm hoping that I didn't just do that. But hopefully it's a tease. He is a fascinating character. The thing I have said about him is he's fun. He is fun to write. And he's a fabulous three-dimensional, very complex character. And as many people have said, he's unique. There has never been another president like him. and probably will never be. And I hope you'll find the book entertaining, because it was certainly entertaining to write.
So Jeff, we just talked about that project. Obviously, you've got other projects on the horizon. Would you like to tell us about like what your current project is, what you're working on it?
I've just finished the manuscript. We're editing it right now in New York, and it'll be out next May on the Cuban Missile Crisis. Thank you for that.
Wow.
Every audience I have said this to, I wait for that one beat to hear that spontaneous response. Because if I ever hear, oh, I'm in big trouble. So no, thank you for the positive response. It's a story that is told from 3 different points of view. Bobby Kennedy, Khrushchev, and I have Khrushchev's memoirs. It's about that thick, and it's this wonderful source. And just a man in the street, and a professor in Tallahassee, Florida, who's raising his 2 kids, and he's getting his news, of course, on the evening news every night from Walter Cronkite, and what the terror of what just the average man is going through as his neighbor's building a fallout shelter, and things like that. And it turned out to be a better story than I was afraid of. Because I shelved this idea a couple of years ago. I just couldn't find an ending, and I just put it aside. And Amazon picked it up, and the publicity people at Random House put out the word that the book existed. And all of a sudden, I'm getting people writing me saying, I'm trying to find your book. The Shadow of War is the title. People trying to find The Shadow of War, and they're being told it's out of print and it's out of stock and they can't get it. It's because it never existed. And I had a fit with the marketing people at Random House. And again, Amazon listed the book for sale, and there was no such thing. So now there will be. So, and of course now my fantasy fear is that now that it's really out there, nobody will ask for it.
So, well, this is a great story, because I've kind of wanted, now that you said that, I had another question I wanted to ask you, I guess, which we'd cover. But I'd like, now that you've said that Amazon, said it existed and it didn't, now it does, how do you come up with these ideas? Is that how you came up? Boy, I better write it, because everybody wanted to have it. So how do you, these topics, it's so wide, it's so varied, because you've gone the whole timeline. How do you decide, okay, I would like to do something on that project? Do you read something, look at it, or how does that happen?
It used to be easier than it is now, because when I'm dealing with, for example, a series, I did a 4-book set on the Civil War in the West: Shiloh, Vicksburg, Chattanooga, and Sherman's March. The original trilogy around the Killer Angels, around my father's book, Gods and Generals and the Last Full Measure. When you have a series, and I did a trilogy on World War II in Europe, the 2-book set in the War in the Pacific. That makes it easy, because you know what the next book's going to be. You know what the beginning and the ending are going to be because of the event. But now I've reached a point where I'm focusing a little bit differently than what I've done in the past. My publisher really is encouraging me to get away from the war books. I hate that description, but I can't deny that's what they are. I mean, they're books about characters. They're not history books, but they're books about characters in war. And in everything, as he said earlier, everything from the American Revolution up through Korea. It's about the people. That's what I do. Well, we're getting away from that. Thus, the Teddy Roosevelt book is a real different approach. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a different approach. Now, and here's the problem, and this is where I'm stuck, of what's going to follow, what's next. I want to focus something, a Vietnam story that's not Vietnam blood and guts. And I don't know how to do that. And I'm working on that. I'm doing a lot of reading right now. And I've talked to a lot of veterans, and they've sent me stuff. I have incredible material. But just to do a story of a guy, going after Charlie in the bush, and the horror stories, and what it's like burning the villages, and what it's like with the Viet Cong, that's not a good story, because there's nothing uplifting about it. And even the veterans I've talked to have admitted that most of them came home like, thank God I never have to go through that again. So I'm trying to figure out a way to make it a story that also deals with the home front and makes it a little more complicated. And I'm working on that right now. As far as something after that, my editor and I sat down in New York after we, came up with Teddy Roosevelt, and we went through every name in American history, every character we could think of. Not one, Henry Ford and Thomas Edison and Mark Twain and, on and on and on. Nobody works. Nobody's Teddy Roosevelt. And so it would be, I think, a letdown to follow with some other character just to do a character because he's not Teddy Roosevelt. It would be a letdown for me to write it. So it's a real problem coming up with, getting whatever the inspiration is to come up with a different idea. And I don't really want to go back. I could people have asked me, after I did Pearl Harbor and Midway, there's Guadalcanal and Iwo Jima. There's all kinds of stories you could do in the Pacific. Yeah, but I'm trying to get away from that. So it's a challenge. It really is.
Is it harder to do the more modern, because people are living and you're talking to people that they're there, and I know you're putting out fiction, but is it more difficult, I guess, than to go back and do it?
Oh, definitely.
And what makes it more difficult, I
Well,
guess?
first of all, when I did the Korea story, I did have a living veteran here locally. He's a man that some of you might have known, and he sat in my living room and told me he was in the Marine Corps at the Chosin Reservoir, and he gave me fabulous information. And he told me the only thing you can't do is ask me about my friends. In other words, he didn't want to talk about the guys who aren't here anymore. Fair enough. But he gave me just fabulous insight. But so there is that. There are advantages. And by the way, when the book came out, I have a photograph of him holding the first copy of the book. And about 3 months later, he passed away. Again, that's the time we're living in when the veterans, particularly World War II and Korea, are no more. And it's tough. It's really difficult. But yeah, in Vietnam, certainly there are all kinds of guys I can talk to, and good stories among, some of them, and some of them are horrible stories. Some of them don't want to talk at all, which I respect. So in fact, somebody said to me, be very careful of the old soldier puts his arm around your shoulder and wants to tell you all his war stories. Because there's a real good chance that guy didn't do any of that stuff. Because the guys who did the stuff don't want to talk about it. I totally understand that I have to respect that.
Be quiet. Well, I've spent time asking questions. Let's go out. I'll take the microphone. We'll go out in the audience, and we'll get some questions from the audience. And maybe take. Who wants to lead it out? Over here. All right. We'll start on this side. We'll go back and forth. Go ahead.
Thank you very much for being here. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I've got a couple questions for you. My first question is, have you ever thought about doing anything about the hostages that were held for 444 days in the early 80s?
The problem with going modern, more modern than Vietnam, and we could talk about the Gulf War. We could talk about, a lot of things like that. Politics is involved.
Okay.
I hate politics. I just don't want to write a political story. And and the way that ended, there was a catastrophe in the way that ended. I don't know that I could make a whole book out of that.
Okay, my second one is, this is for your wife and you. What does Jeff like? You're always doing books and you're always doing this, and you've been married, so apparently you must do something to, have a wife that sticks with you. Hobby, Jeff.
I will
Jeff
say
like?
this. She has threatened to do her own interview
Oh, we may have to book that. Yeah.
on what life is like with Jeff Shaara. And
Jeff Shaara.
it may not be that pretty.
All right. Who we got? All right. Yes, sir.
You took my Vietnam question. I was going to ask that. Thanks for being here tonight. Have you ever considered doing a book on Custer?
Yeah, we've talked about Custer. It's a possibility. The problem is depending on what you do. If Custer's the good guy, it's politically incorrect because these days Custer's not the good guy. If you do Sitting Bull as the good guy, there's a chance that a lot of people aren't going to want to read the book because they don't want to hear that. it gets into, again, that ugly word that I hate, which is politics. And politics affects that story. In any of the stories in the Indian Wars, with Sheridan and Nelson Miles, and I mean, all those stories out west, they're all ugly stories. And I'm not sure how I could handle that. It would be a real challenge.
All right, over on this side, Ted.
You used the word manuscript, and it reminded me of asking your thoughts on whether in the days before either the internet or real word processing, was it easier to be a writer, or today you can edit every 10 seconds? Does that make it worse or better?
I can tell you, and I appreciate that question, because I can tell you right now at the new museum at the Adams County History Center, they have the original, my family has made on loan to them, the original manuscript of the Killer Angels. It's a mess. I mean, whole paragraphs are scratched out, things are written in the margin. My father did all of that. I learned to type as a kid, typing my father's manuscripts back in the day, and you have to be of a certain age to know what carbon paper is. And, the old black Royal typewriter, and that's how I learned to type. I think it's a lot easier today. I mean, with Word for Windows, which is what I use, I can cut and paste and do all kinds of autocorrect and all of that kind of stuff that my father, struggled with. And I can remember, making a single typo mistake with 4 sheets of carbon paper, and you had to take them all out and, change every page, get the little eraser thing, and, it would take forever. Now it's so much faster. And so I think that's a real advantage. That doesn't mean, by the way, the technology, I can now send in an email my manuscript to New York. In the old days, you packed up the paper and you sent it off registered mail. I still print out the paper. And my editor gets it and he prints out the paper. We're both old school. We have to have paper. So I don't trust that computer business. I don't trust the cloud. I don't know what the cloud is. So.
All right, let's go over here toward the center. Sure.
First of all, thank you for being here and doing this.
Thank you.
If this isn't too painful, I know The Killer Angels was released, and I believe your dad passed shortly thereafter and never knew the success that this thing ultimately became. But my question is, how old were you when all that happened? And then what triggered you to begin writing in Gods and Generals and kind of follow in that footstep?
Yeah, Killer Angels came out in 1974. I was 22. And my father, he wins a Pulitzer Prize in 1975. Every writer who wins a Pulitzer Prize has the right to believe his ship has come in. They're going to fight over his next book. He's going to be a bestseller, all of that. None of that happened to Michael Shaara. And it was a bitter disappointment to him until finally Ted Turner came along. And Ted Turner bought the rights to the film, to the book, to make the movie. And the movie came out in 1993, as you know, its 30th anniversary this October, and made The Killer Angels a #1 bestseller 5 years after my father's death. He had no idea what he had left behind. Ted people and Ron Maxwell came to me after the success of Gettysburg and said, Ted wants to make more movies. And, Ted gets excited. And so the idea was to take my father's book and go in both directions, before and after, create stories using a lot of the same characters that Ted can make into a movie. It was always about film. The idea, and I thought about this, and I thought this is something I want to try to do. So I started working on what became Gods and Generals, and we actually had the conversation, Ron Maxwell and I, if whatever I come up with stinks, it goes in the garbage. Nobody will ever see it. So there was no fear. There were no expectations. I was just putting this story together. Meanwhile, I'm the businessman in the family. I'm representing my father's estate in New York. Random House has this #1 bestseller now in Killer Angels. So I'm talking to the publisher, and I told her what I was doing. I said, I'm working on the prequel. It's called Gods and Generals. And she says, send us the manuscript. Okay. I sent them the manuscript. The phone call I got back was, we don't care if it's a movie, we like the book. Here's a contract. That changed my whole life. And I was 44 years old when that, 43 years old when that happened. So I embarked on an entirely new career in my 40s, and with no expectation that here I'd be sitting here talking to you 19 books later. I mean, nobody's more amazed by this whole thing than I am.
All right. Who else? All the way over here. We'll get to
Yeah,
Dan.
somebody, and he's had his hands up in the back over
Oh,
there.
okay. Let's
Yeah.
get to Dan, then we'll go over here then. Okay. All right.
I don't have a question. I just want to see Wayne run up the steps over here.
I needed that, Jeff.
I do have a comment, though. On my Christmas list was chosen Pearl Harbor and the Cuban Missile Crisis. And no one could find the Cuban Missile
Yes,
Crisis. And now I know why.
Yes.
I'm very much looking forward to it.
Thank you.
All right, we're going over here. There you go. Excuse us.
Thank you for being here tonight. I'm a big fan of your work.
Thank you.
You spoke of the similarities and difference that you have with your father and the way you do your work in that. Do you think the characters that you wrote about, that he wrote about as well, like Lee and Chamberlain, are much different than the way that he thought they were?
Yeah, that's a good question, because my assumption when I started working on Gods and Generals was I was going to have the same characters. And when I got into Longstreet, my Longstreet is very different from my father's. And that was a surprise. It made me really nervous, too. Chamberlain, I would say there are a lot of similarities. Lee, there are a lot of similarities. My father sort of created a template with those characters that I could, rely on. Of course, then I had Stonewall Jackson. My father did not. So that was my character. And I hope he's accurate, to the man. And then when I did Last Full Measure, I had Grant, which was another fabulous character that broke from what my father had done. So I never set out to mimic, and people have accused me of mimicking my father's style. I don't think you can do that, because I think you run out of gas, spending all your energy mimicking, and not, you lose the substance of the story. But my sister actually pointed out to me, whose writing have you read more of than anybody else's? Whose writing has had more influence on you than anybody else's? And certainly it's my father. But then he also, the other thing about Killer Angels, he invented what he did with Killer Angels. Going back and forth from these historical characters' points of view and real people and telling you the story through their eyes. Nobody had ever done that before. So that format I've taken, and that format I use, and I've used in every book I've done until Teddy Roosevelt. Then you just have the one character. But, certainly my father paved the way, and I recognize clearly, I'm walking in enormous footsteps.
Other questions? Who's got right over here? I don't see how I'm sorry. Let me see if I can get over this way. All right. Here you go.
You mentioned you didn't start writing till you were in your 40s. What did you do before that? Were you a historian or?
No, I'll answer that sort of from the beginning. My degree at Florida State, because a lot of people assume I have a history degree. My degree from Florida State is in criminology. I wanted to be a game warden. That was,
Wow.
I was a woods and water kid growing up in Tallahassee, and I saw people doing things they ought not be doing in the woods. And so that was my goal. And then, along that way, and starting when I was at age 16, I was a rare coin dealer. I dealt in rare. I was a numismatist, dealt in rare coins, and by the time I graduated from FSU, I was making more money in the coin business than the state of Florida would pay me to be a game warden. So I never did that. And I became a pretty large-scale coin and precious metals dealer down in Tampa. And that's what I was doing. And I eventually sold my business and began this career. Yep.
Wow. Something I didn't know. That's a lot. I'm sure everybody didn't know that. Other questions?
Right
Who's
here.
got- Yes, sir.
You mentioned different topics that you might consider. Have you written anything on the Alamo?
No, the Alamo. One of the problems with the Alamo is it's been done so many times, and it's been done wrong so many times. The history is, I mean, the John Wayne stuff and all that is way out of bounds, historically speaking. It would have to be more than the Alamo. It would have to be Sam Houston. There would have to be much more to the story than just the Alamo. And we've talked about it. Originally, somebody at my publisher said, you know, they like the idea because people in Texas buy books, and they especially buy books about Texas. I suppose that's true, but the problem is anybody outside of Texas is going to buy the book. So I don't have an answer for that. I mean, it's one of those that's, again, it's on the list. You know, it's a possibility down the road.
And then I thought of a couple other possible topics, although I know they get into politics. One would be about the writing of the Constitution, and then the Louisiana Purchase.
Well, the Constitution, I can tell you, I did a 2-book set on the American Revolution. It was discussed to make it a trilogy, and the 3rd book would have been the Constitutional Convention. The problem is, when you're talking about the war, and George Washington and Nathaniel Greene and Cornwallis and Mad Anthony Wayne and all of this, you know, all of that, Benedict Arnold, it's anticlimactic to go to the Constitutional Convention because what really happens there is a whole lot of talk. And, you know, after you've just read the first 2, it's kind of tough to get excited about that. And so I sort of ran into a brick wall with that one. So.
All right, we've got this side. Or anybody over here who's got more? Yes, sir.
It's nice to see you again, Jeff.
Thank you.
I attended one of the ranger walks today on Culp's Hill, and I was fairly ignorant about it. I read history. I probably haven't read as many books on history as you've written, but General Greene I was totally unfamiliar with. And just the description of his childhood, what he went through, how he got into West Point and so forth. I guess it kind of comes close to being a biography. But what went on in Culp's Hill, I don't think the average person knows about. Chamberlain is my wife's hero. And what I learned today, what he did there far surpasses what Chamberlain did.
I don't know that I would say it surpasses it, but it comes close to equaling it. And you know, you make a good point because one of the knocks against the Killer Angels is where's Culp's Hill? Where's Dan Sickles? You know, I mean, these people aren't there, and my father would just bristle at that. His response would be, "This is not the history of the Battle of Gettysburg. It's a story about the Battle of Gettysburg. You know, it's a story about these 4 people." And what what takes place. Is there an opportunity then to do another one, you know, and focus on Culp's Hill, focus on Greene? Probably. I don't know that's something I would do because the assumption would be that I'm competing with the Killer Angels. I will never do that. By the way, the Killer Angels turns 50 years old next year, 2024. They want me to write, they're going to put a big sunburst thing on the cover of the hardcover, you know, saying 50th anniversary. They want me to write an introduction to the paperback. I have always resisted doing that because I didn't want to putting my words in my father's book seemed inappropriate to me. That's his monument. But enough time has passed now, I think that and my sister, I asked her. If she had said no, I would not do it. But, you know, enough time has passed that I think I will do it. But to write another book, I'll leave that to somebody else. And I know there are books about Culp's Hill. There are a couple good ones. They're not novels. You know, they're not done the way The Killer Angels is done. And maybe it's time for somebody to do that. No.
All right. Other questions? Right up here. Okay.
It's not a smart question, but you mentioned earlier Walter Cronkite. And I remember a time I'm old enough to remember a time when he took a vacation. Maybe you've heard the story. And he didn't come back on time. He was going to be gone like a week or 10 days. And when 2 weeks he hadn't been back, Americans were talking about the fact that he was dead and that he was such an important person that they didn't know how to tell us that he was dead. So I wonder if he'd be somebody you'd ever write about.
Well, I mean, he's not in the Cuban book as a character. He's on TV, and you know they're watching the nightly news. You know, that's an I mean, he is an interesting character, but I don't know that that's a whole book. I mean, it would take you'd really have to get into minutia to expand that to a book, and that might be kind of tough. And one of the problems is, too, and one of the risks of doing something like Cuban Missile Crisis, there are an awful lot of people, and there's some of them in this room who are too young to remember and have no idea what I'm talking about. I don't know if they teach that in schools. I have no idea. But, you know, young people, to educate young people on what happened in 1962, I take that on as a mission, because young people need to know how close we came. Because it hasn't happened since, and it's getting close to, people will say, it's getting close to happening right now. Maybe. But that was the real deal. And people need to know that story. So.
All right, who's got other questions? Right here.
I would expect you would say your father was a big inspiration. What other authors might fit that category for you?
This is going to sound strange. I don't read novels. I write novels, but I don't read novels. The reason is I'm terrified of being accused of plagiarism. And if you write a novel that's on a similar subject to what I'm working on, and I read that, and a single line of your dialogue sticks in my head and comes out totally by accident in my book, that's the pure definition of plagiarism. That could cost me my career. So I'm very careful about what I read. And so, you know, when I talk about the people who inspire me, it's the subjects in my books. It's Teddy Roosevelt. It's Joshua Chamberlain. It's, you know, the people who've written their Ulysses Grant. You know, Grant's memoir is a wonderful book. On and on. I mean, Dwight Eisenhower, the Crusade. I can't remember the title.
Crusade in Europe?
Crusade in Europe,
Crusade
yeah.
in Europe.
And, you know, I mean, that's what I read that inspires me, is the accounts of these people, the accounts of the people who were, you know, there when I'm trying to write about them. You know, Erwin Rommel's memoir, Patton's papers, George Patton's diary, which is amazing. He tells you what he really thinks about Eisenhower. I mean, when you're writing a diary, who are you writing to? You're writing to yourself. You don't think someone like me, you know, 70 years later is going to be reading it, and it's some pretty gritty stuff. But so that's what gets me excited, is, you know, that kind of material. So.
All right, other questions? Who's got it? I've got one I want to ask. I'm going to take moderator's prerogative here while the rest of them are thinking. So you've done 19 books, Jeff. You've got a 20th coming out. Mm-hmm. I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you have, and I'm sure you have favorites for different reasons, but do you have, of all these projects that you've done, do you have one that really resonated with you personally, more so, I guess, than the others? They're all great projects. I'm sure you saw them done, but do you have a favorite, I guess? Is that the right word?
I have a few.
Okay.
I'll mention one particular, and it's called Gone for Soldiers. It's my book about the Mexican War.
Oh, wow.
And the reason I mention that is, you know the characters. It's, you know, it's Lee and Longstreet and Pickett and Grant and, you know, on and on and on in a setting, you know, 13 years before they were fighting each other, when they were in Mexico fighting on the same side under the great character of Winfield Scott, who's a tremendous character. And on the other side is Santa Anna, who is so much fun to write. I have his memoir. It's a story I didn't know. I had no idea. In fact, I had no interest in writing the story until I was researching Gods and Generals in The Last Full Measure, and all these characters, how many of them talk about their experience in Mexico and how that shaped them and how they became soldiers in Mexico. and turned the light bulb on for me. I mean, that you talk about being inspired by reading stuff. That got me excited, and so I did a book on the Mexican War, and I think it's a good book, and I think it's a lot of fun. And Santa Anna is a great hoot of a character, and crazy things happen in this story, and they're all true. So that's one I would say. The other one is my Korea book. I've mentioned that already, but it was emotional to write because like I said, I had a veteran sitting in my living room telling me the stories. It was emotional to write. It was difficult to write, and I think it's my best book. It won 3 awards, including one from the Marine Corps, which I cherish. The Marines considered it worthy of giving me an award, because it's about them and what they did. So that's probably the short answer. I could talk about, in some way, I could talk about every book. If I'm working on a book and I'm not in love with it, it's not going to happen. I'm in love with every story I'm working on. And so it's easy to explain that in every book I've done, and that would bore you all after a while, I'm sure.
Is the book that you did on the Chosin Reservoir, was that because of the sacrifice and what the men went through? And
Very much so.
All that?
Very
That
much
is
so,
why
yes.
it was so difficult for you to put that
And
down?
the other thing, and I was working on that book, and I was at the Smithsonian in Washington giving a talk, and I said to the audience that I'm really having a problem with that book because we lose. I mean, the Marines don't win the fight. And I was leaving the talk, and I was in the elevator, and there was this old guy in the elevator, and he said to me, and he started chewing me out. He was a medic or a corpsman in Korea with the Marines, and he was probably in his 80s, and he said, "You're wrong." He said, "Because we made it out of there, we lived to fight another day." That's the last line of the book from General Smith's, O.P. Smith's perspective, to realizing that they lived to fight another day. And that gave me huge inspiration to finish that story. And that, it is an upbeat ending even though we lose the fight. We lose the battle, we win the war, kind of thing.
All right. Other questions we've got? Oh, right here. Okay.
Yeah, thanks for coming again.
Thank you.
Can you describe some of the research you did and some of the materials you used in writing Gods and Generals?
I used, when I started working on Gods and Generals, I had no clue what I was doing. And I'm not being, modest about that. I mean, I had never written anything before, but I remembered the research my father had done. And I remember him, having to track down, in his day, library lending programs. He'd go to the FSU library and they'd borrow a book from the University or from Bowdoin College, some Chamberlain book or something, and it would take 4 months. And, that's one reason why it took 7 years for him to write The Killer Angels. But I learned that lesson, of reading the accounts of the people who were there. And I picked up books like Walter Taylor's book on Robert E. Lee. He was there. Because Lee never wrote his own memoirs. So you have Lee's letters, but you don't have a memoir from Lee. So you have to rely on the people that were around him. Stonewall Jackson's wife wrote a fabulous memoir on her husband's life. Myra Hancock, Winfield Hancock's wife, wrote a memoir in which she talks about the famous because of Killer Angels, the scene in California, when the splitting up of good friends, the tearful scene of Armistead saying to Hancock, "If I ever raise my sword against you, may God strike me dead." And of course, on July 3rd, 1863, that's exactly what he's doing. That scene, which I was able to write in Gods and Generals, I take you there. It came out of her book. And there are some people who say that never happened, that it's a myth. I'm sorry, why would she lie? The book came out in about 1890, and I've got it. That kind of stuff. I mean, that was the lesson I learned from my father. That kind of material is the best research. I also read Shelby Foote. I read the trilogy. I figured I need to know the facts. I need to know the history. So, that was important to kind of use that as a background, too.
Got a question.
Thank you, Jeff. When you have completed all of your research and you sit down and you finally put fingers to keyboard, which is the hardest sentence to write, the first or the last of the book?
Oh, the first. Oh, there's no doubt. The writing, staring at the blank screen and having to, and then because once the first sentence comes out, the rest just flows. At least it does for me. And I liken it to a faucet turning on. And when the faucet turns on, you just go with it. But yeah, I'll stare at that, and I'll write something, and no, that doesn't work. And I'll go through that. The end, by the time I get to the last sentence in the book, I'm so into it. I'm so familiar with what's happened, and so with the characters and the emotion of it, that it's up to me, the writer, to come up with something that's an appropriate ending, to end on a big beat. And that, to me, that's easier than writing that first sentence.
Were there any characters that you had wanted to include in some of your books that you didn't get the chance to because they didn't fit for whatever reason?
There are two. When I did my book on the American Revolution, the first book, I intended to use as a character Thomas Paine. I mean, Thomas Paine's writing changes history. But as I did the research, I thought his point of view would be an important one. And I got into the research on the man, and I describe him in the afterword of the book as the man himself is utterly unremarkable. He's a curmudgeonly guy that nobody likes. He gets himself in trouble. He spends time in prison. He's a drunk at the end of his life. And and I said all this. I talked to audiences just like this one about this. I found out there's a Thomas Paine Society. They didn't take kindly to my description. So I have to learn to sort of be a little more discreet. But the other character is Phil Sheridan, the Civil War story. At Appomattox, when Lee's army is defeated, and 25,000 men, only 8,000 of them have guns. I mean, and they've had no food, and Lee has escaped from Petersburg, and his army is beat. They are surrounded on three sides by 70,000 Union soldiers under the field command is Phil Sheridan. Sheridan intends to attack. He says, we've got them. There they are. And let's go ahead and finish the job. This is all true, by the way. Grant rides up. Grant has been communicating with Lee, and we have these letters, word for word, what was said back and forth, about an armistice, a truce, stop shooting. And Grant's writing, he's out in the countryside, and he's writing lickety-split, trying to get there. He rides up to Sheridan, and Sheridan says, we're ready to go. And, just give the word. And Grant says, have you not heard that Lee wants a truce? And Sheridan says, it's a rebel trick. Grant says, why don't we go to the McLean house and talk to Lee and find out if it's a rebel trick? And so Sheridan pulls in his horns, and that's the end of that. And Grant goes to meet with Wilmer McLean's house, and that's, the rest is history. Had Grant not ridden up when he did, Sheridan would have ordered that assault and would have gone down in our history as our greatest butcher, because there would have been no contest to it. That I didn't like the guy. That really bothered me. I intended to write that chapter from Sheridan's point of view. And instead, if you read Last Full Measure, it's Joshua Chamberlain's point of view at the end. So, yeah, that's the best example I can think of where it just didn't work. I didn't like the guy, and I can't get into his head. So.
All right, we've got time for one more, probably. We'll take it right over here then.
Were there many ideas for manuscripts that you had, and you started, and then once you got into it, you said, oh, this isn't going to work, or I don't really like this, and you let them go?
the Cuba story is the closest I came to that. I didn't actually start writing it, but I realized that I didn't have an ending that I was happy with. I do now. But no, I've never, I'm so fortunate, and I don't take this for granted, I promise you, but based on what my father went through, you know, growing up in the house of a writer and seeing what he did, and he would write, and there's a great example of this, but he wrote manuscripts and he couldn't sell them, he gave up on them, you know, they were partial manuscripts, tons of them. Short stories as well. He was a short story writer to start with. Sci-fi short stories. He published 70 short stories. But one of the books that he gave up on, I would imagine some of you are familiar with a baseball movie starring Kevin Costner called For Love of the Game. Not everybody is, because people think when I'm saying Kevin Costner, I'm talking about Bull Durham or Field of Dreams. But no, For Love of the Game, Kevin Costner and Kelly Preston. That movie is based on my father's book. My father had given up on that book. After he died, my sister and I took it to New York, shopped it around, got it published. Universal Pictures jumped all over it. Kevin Costner jumped all over it, and they made the movie. That's a perfect example of how time changes. You know, how what's in fashion can change. He has another full manuscript that you can buy it online now. It's called The Rebel in Autumn, and it's a college riots story in the 60s. And he sent this to New York about a week before Kent State. So Kent State happens, and the publisher's looking at this thing going, well, you know, you're just copying what happened at Kent State. My father was, you know, lost it. I mean, that was, he liked this story a lot, and just, you know, that was the end of that. So you can buy it now. You can actually download it now, because I made arrangements with a publisher to do that. And it's not the greatest story in the world. It's not Killer Angels. But, yeah, I mean, he struggled with that. And I have been very fortunate, because I don't have a lot of unfinished manuscripts floating around the house.
Wow. Ladies and gentlemen, Jeff Shaara, New York Times bestseller list author, right here in the Gettysburg community. Jeff, we're just, yeah. And Steve will take your mic up there. I'll let you get. We're gonna send Jeff out to get out there at the table, because if you don't have these titles, you need to stop and get them. And he spent all day signing, and he spent his evening with you. So we can't thank him enough for doing that on behalf of the Gettysburg Foundation and the Gettysburg National Military Park. We will leave you this evening. Hope to see you back tomorrow. I want to thank Steve Sims, Gettysburg National Military Park Superintendent, Chris Gwynn, the Chief of Interpretation and Education, floating around here somewhere. To both of them, all their teams that have made possible all the great programs out on the battlefield. Be sure to check them out, because they had a great time out there today. They're going to do it again tomorrow. And also for Sacred Trust, our programming here, weather permitting, inside the tent, weather not permitting, inside the building. That will start at 9:30 tomorrow, and our first program will be National Park Service educator John Hoptack on the South Central Pennsylvania connections to the 54th Massachusetts, right here in this building. If you're not a member of our organization, we would love to have you, because the preservation mission of this group to support Gettysburg National Military Park and Eisenhower National Historic Site, not only is it so important, not only is it so necessary, but we know all of you already care about it, or else you wouldn't be sitting in this room. So join us, come out, see the desk out front for the folks that are here tomorrow while you're around here on the weekend. We hope you have a wonderful 160th anniversary here at Gettysburg on behalf of the Gettysburg Foundation and the National Park. Thank you very much. Everybody have a good evening.